Okay, well, on my computer it says that it's 9 o'clock, and there's a couple of things. We're doing this class just a little bit, well, that's not true, a lot of bit different. This is a lot different from normal because there is ice all over my driveway and my street, and so I'm teaching from home this morning. Um, just a couple things. I turned off the chat screen right now because I'm not able to multitask that well. I've got my screen that I'm recording on right here, and then I've got another screen that has my PowerPoint so I can run that for you all. And I've got my notes and I've got my Bible. So it would be probably nice if you had your Bible this morning. I'm going to be turning and reading a couple different things, a lot of different things probably, but I was planning on, if we were in class, just running through the list and having different people read, but I'll probably just go ahead and do that. But a couple things before we get started. First of all, for our church family, for those of you who are logged on, Jake Hersey's dad, Kelly, passed away last night. So Jake and Allie were able to go down there last week. I'm pretty sure you should have got that email whenever he sent it out. But you'll probably want to send Jake a message and let him know that you're thinking about him. And I don't know what the plan is for when they intend to come back home, but that is what Jake and Allie and Nora and Edgar are up to right now. Give me 1 second here. It looks like my camera is out of focus, so sometimes maybe if I can get it to clear back up. There we go. Okay, so that's the only thing that I have church family note related. As far as this stream and this class is concerned, I was hoping for a lot of participation in class this morning with this. I've got a lot of built-in spots to ask questions and get some feedback from you all. So since we can't do that in a normal setting, I have my lovely assistant Becky sitting across the table from me right now with her computer open. And so Becky's going to be watching the comments. So I tested this stream a little bit ago, and it looks like there's a 12-second delay. So when I say something, it doesn't get to you until 12 seconds later. But if you have a comment, or if there's something that you would like to throw into this class, just go ahead and write it in the comments, or you can text Becky, and she's sitting in front of her phone and the computer, and she will just get my attention and let me know what that comment is, and we can hopefully try and make this as much like a class as we possibly can. And then I will also say this, and then we'll go ahead and get started. The reason why I'm going ahead with this right now is because I've got 12 classes this quarter, but about 13, there's normally 13 classes in a quarter every Sunday morning. And I don't have enough classes to cover all the stuff that I want to cover. And so there's that. So I want to get this class going and get this material out there so that I don't have to get any more behind. But also next Sunday, I'm going to be out of town because I'm going to Shane Scott's funeral in Florida, and Kevin's going to be teaching class. So he's already got my notes and he's ready to teach that class, and I didn't want to throw another extra curveball at him and say, here's a different class that I need you to teach, so I need to stay on schedule with that. And then also the third Sunday of the month is our Revelation weekend. That's when people will be coming in town. I think we have about 35 people coming in town who are going to do highlighting Revelation on Friday and Saturday. And then my class and sermon on Sunday morning in 3 weeks is going to be Revelation stuff. So I was afraid that if I didn't start this class now, I wouldn't get anywhere close to covering the stuff that I wanted to cover. But that's all that I'll say about that for introduction stuff. Let me switch over to this screen, and hopefully you will have enough time to write some comments on this, because this is what I wanted to start our class with from the very start, and that is, are the Old Testament laws relevant to Christians today? I want to know what you think about that. Just give it some thought, write it in the comments, and Becky's going to let me know what at least some of those comments are if you say them. But whenever I talk about the Old Testament law, I think sometimes when I say Old Testament, Law of Moses, Old Testament law, Old Covenant, sometimes whenever I use those words, I'm talking about Genesis to Malachi. But specifically right now, when I say the Old Testament law, I'm talking about when you read through something like Exodus 21, and it says, this is what you do if your ox gores your neighbor's ox. And this is how you pay that person back, and this is how much responsible you are for that. So when I talk about the Old Testament laws, that's what we're going to be looking at this quarter. And the question is, are Old Testament laws still relevant for us and for Christians today? Do you have anything in the comments yet? What do you got so far?
Nick says, the old law is relevant. It helps us to gain knowledge of what sin is and furthers our understanding of God's character.
Okay, so that's good. Let's do God's character first, because we're going to be talking a lot about that. Becky said that Nick said it helps us to understand God's character. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, but I think Kevin's going to have a lot to say about that next week and some of the positive reasons why we would look at the law. But then he also said it helps us to understand sin. And I think that's right. This is God's law. And he said, don't do these things. And that's giving us a sense of what God does not want us to do. It helps us to understand what sin is. Now, there's going to be some bumps in that road because some of the laws, like if you have multiple wives and your second wife has your oldest son, your firstborn son, then you're not allowed to let your firstborn son be the secondborn son who is from your favorite wife. Your firstborn son is your firstborn son, regardless of what wife it's from. That's an Old Testament law. And so, what are we going to do with that? How is that going to teach us about sin and about the character of God? We'll have to work through some of those things. What else you got?
Kevin said that the law helps us to understand the nature of God. Exodus 34, 6 through 9 says, the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. And Moses quickly bowed his head toward the earth and worshipped, and he said, if now I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, please let the Lord go in the midst of us, for it is a stiff-necked people, and pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance.
Yeah. So the idea of what justice is, he is a merciful God, and so that means that he shows mercy, but we would need to understand, what did you do that's guilty that you need to be shown mercy in the first place? But then also, he won't leave the guilty unpunished. So yeah, we're going to understand the character of God and what sin is. Again, what else you got?
And Dustin said, I believe the old law is also written to provide foundational moral principles and points to Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of the law.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's good. I think both of those are great. Pointing to Jesus as the fulfillment of the law is definitely going to be something. I think that we're going to mention that today, this morning, but also the idea of foundational moral principles. I'm a little surprised so far. Did anybody say anything negative about the law, or just no, everybody's there? So I've got this quote. I'm going to be quoting, a lot of my quotes this quarter are going to come from, I read a couple books to prepare for this class, but one of them was from a guy named Gain, Gane, and I think the title of that book was The Old Testament Law and Christians. And this is one thing that he said: A rich source of wisdom regarding values is contained in the Old Testament, which is what you've been talking about. We learn about sin and the character of God, the values. However, Christians have generally neglected these laws to our loss because we have not regarded them as relevant to our lives. And I think that's definitely true to me. I don't study the law to know what the laws are in the Old Testament, like Exodus 21, 22, and 23. There's a big chunk of law right there. I don't study those laws to learn about the stuff that I'm supposed to be doing and not supposed to be doing. And I think I'm going to change that a little bit after this class. So let me give you a little bit of a roadmap for what I'm going to do this quarter, but also what I'm going to do today. In this class, I'm going to be spending, this is going to be, I think I can click this over for you right now. This class is the negative side of the law of Moses. No, Christians are not bound by the Old Testament law, by the law of Moses. We're going to be looking at several passages just to make that abundantly crystal clear that we are not bound by the Old Testament. The New Testament writers have a lot to say about that, and we should not ignore that. It needs to be the first thing that we talk about. So on one hand, this morning, no, we are not bound by the Old Testament. But on the other hand, this is what Kevin's going to talk about next Sunday morning and what most of your comments have said up to this point. Yes, there is still value in the Old Testament law. There are good reasons why we should study it and why we should be familiar with it. And so I think Kevin's going to talk about some of those different reasons. I think we're going to be talking, you mentioned these. I got a list. Why? Why are we going to be doing the Old Testament law? We're going to learn about the character of God. We're going to learn about some things that God expects from me. And it may not be necessarily that the law says, I'll give you an example. I think we're going to read this a little bit later. But there is an example. There's a law in the law of Moses that says if your neighbor's ox gets loose and you find it, you're not allowed to just ignore it and go about your own business. It is your responsibility to help that person with their ox. And that law is, there's one in Exodus and there's one in Deuteronomy. And I don't remember which one of these is the case, but one of those say if your neighbor's ox is lost, but one of those says if your enemy's ox is lost, you still have to help him get it out of a pit or return it to him or keep it until you can get it back to him. And so, how would that law apply to us today? Last week I was outside bringing my trash cans in and I saw a little boy chasing his dog around. And I thought about that law and I thought, you know what? This is not something that I'm allowed to just ignore and pretend like it's not my problem. This is, we read these laws, we understand their intent, and we say, this is what God expects from his people. And so those are, what does God expect from me? That's the second thing. There's a third thing that I think might be kind of important for this class that I'm shooting for, and that is, how am I supposed to think? And I mean just lining my own thoughts and attitude up with God and his thoughts and his attitude. And so let me go through some slides here real quick and show you what I'm talking about. These are some headlines from, I don't know if this is just from last week or for the last couple of weeks, but this is a headline from the Associated Press. Biden gives life in prison to 37 of 40 federal death row inmates before Trump can resume executions. So we have a death penalty in our country for certain circumstances, and there's 40 people in the federal prison system right now who have been given the death penalty, who are waiting for the death penalty. And President Biden said to 37 of them, no, you don't have to do the death penalty, because he doesn't think that the death penalty is something that we should do. And So, you see a headline like that. And this is why I think this is a different point from the last point, because there's not really anything that I can do about that. There's no expectation that it's not like God says, no, the death penalty is something that you should do, and the government is not doing it, so you go and find these people and kill them. There's nothing that I can do about it. But what am I supposed to think about it? What is right and wrong? And how should the Christian approach these situations? Here's another one that might be a little bit more sensitive. NPR, Trump says he'll support free IVF, that's in vitro fertilization treatments, in his second term. And so one of the things that our president has been campaigning on is the idea of we need not only IVF, but it's a very expensive process, but also it needs to be government funded for people to be able to get pregnant through IVF. And I don't know if you have seen this or if you have known anything about this, but IVF oftentimes gets lumped in with the abortion conversation and whether or not it is morally right for a Christian, but just one of God's people in general, that would include Jews under the Old Testament, if it's morally right for a Christian to go through this process. And the reason why is because you have several eggs that are fertilized by sperm, and then you freeze them, and then you go through this process of implanting several of those eggs at a time in a woman. And if she gets pregnant, what are you going to do with the other frozen fertilized eggs? So we've created life. You have fertilized an egg with a sperm. That's the start of life. And they're sitting over there frozen. Do you just throw them in the trash can? And does that constitute murder in the same way that abortion would be murder, or the same way that sticking a knife through your neighbor's face would be murder? Like, what is life and how do we treat it? Some of the Old Testament laws are going to help us in our thinking about how God views some of these things. Here's another headline. Former stripper, convicted killer, Crystal Magnum, finally confesses to lying about being raped by Duke lacrosse players in 2006. That was a huge story in 2006. There were 3 Duke lacrosse players who this girl said they raped her, and it was a giant story, a giant production. At this point, we can call it a lynching and a witch hunt, because I think it was 2 weeks ago maybe, this girl came out and made a video, and she said, yeah, I made the whole thing up. They didn't rape me. I did it for attention. So again, there's nothing that I can do about that. But how am I supposed to think about that? What is the right thing to do? Because I want to think about right and wrong in the way that God thinks about right and wrong. And whenever I saw this headline, I thought, oh, hey, look, there's Old Testament laws that help us to understand these kind of things. And then there's one last headline that I have from the BBC, assisted dying, euthanasia. I have a problem and I'm sick and I'm going to die anyway, or I'm depressed, or whatever the issue is, and I don't want to live anymore, so just kill me. That's a thing. In Canada, I see headlines a lot on this. Assisted dying now accounts for 1 in 20 Canada deaths. So what are we going to do about that? Is it okay to participate in euthanasia? You don't want to be alive anymore, so just go ahead and kill yourself, or medically take care of it that way. But then the euthanasia conversation, what does the Bible have to say about suicide? Because that's a conversation that we have a lot. All of these things that have to do with life and death. And we're going to kind of move a little bit from the Law of Moses class into an ethics class too, because, then the conversation is going to be, and we're all going to face something like this. Probably we're all going to face something like this. What do you do when somebody in your family is not functional and on life support? Given this conversation about life and the way that God values life, is it morally acceptable to take that person off of life support and let nature take its course. And, you know, I know it's kind of gross to talk about these subjects, but we better talk about these subjects and have some sense of what we can do and what we can't do and what we should do before the time comes. And so the law of Moses is really going to help us to understand what to think. Becky is showing me that she has some comments, but I want to do something real quick about this on what to think. First of all, God's people are supposed to mourn evil. So let me read a couple passages to you. Psalm 119 and verse 135. Psalm 119, 135. My eyes shed streams of tears because people do not keep your law. That's what I want to be. I want to be somebody who's lined up with God, and when I see immorality in the world, I want to mourn that. And then here's another one that it kind of scares me, and I think it should. Ezekiel chapter 9 and verse 4 says, the Lord said to him, pass through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads. Listen, who gets marked? This is marked for salvation from the description. Put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it. So, God says, if you're living in Jerusalem and you are not okay with the sin that's happening around you, we're going to mark you and you don't have to be destroyed by the coming destruction. And I think that applies to Christians in the world today. Are we just, participating in it through acceptance and, hey, everything's okay? Or do we weep and mourn and groan over the sin that we see around us, because the Bible says that we should? And the other side of that coin, 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 6, love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but it rejoices with the truth. So I want to rejoice with things that are right. Proverbs 21 and verse 15, when justice is done, it is a joy to the righteous, but terror to evil doers. And then I also have Philippians 4:8 listed on this one. Whatever is true, honorable, pure, just, pure, lovely, commendable. If there's anything excellent, anything worthy of praise, think about these things. So how am I supposed to think? That's the kind of stuff that I want to talk about in this class. All right, I'll take a breath. What's my comments?
There's just one, and it came in at the beginning of this little section, but I think it's still applicable. Mark shared Matthew 5:38 through 42. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. He said, perhaps we should see the law as a good standard, but Jesus says, make your response even better. Don't just return the ox to your neighbor, but perhaps feed it first.
Yeah, that's really good. I don't know if you all can hear that, what Becky said in the microphone, but Mark made a comment. You can see it on the YouTube channel, but Mark, that comment is one that I read something in preparing for this class that really got my brain rolling here just a little bit, and that is, Christians oftentimes say, which is what you see on the screen right now, Christians are no longer bound by the Old Testament law. And that's true. All of the passages that we're going to look at, that's true. But I think sometimes what happens in our mind is we say, we're not bound by the Old Testament law. That means I don't have to do it. But what Mark just pointed us to is, we're not bound by the Old Testament law. We actually have a higher standard. And that is, we don't just do the things that the Old Testament law points us towards, but we actually make that a part of who we are in our hearts. That's what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. I'm not just talking about you're not allowed to kill somebody. It's don't even hate somebody. So there's a higher standard, not a lower standard from the law of Moses. Okay, anything else before we get rolling? What about you guys? Anything over there? Okay. So let's go through this list. I was going to do it this way in class. I was going to say, everybody pick one of those passages. I don't have nice little cards to hand out, but everybody pick one of those passages and read it but we'll just read it this way. Maybe we'll do most of them, maybe not all of them. But Ephesians chapter 2 and verses 14 through 16. This might be, I looked through all of these different passages and I thought, which one is like the key? If you only had one passage and none of these other passages, which one would it be? It might be something like the whole book of Hebrews, but this is the one that I think I would choose. Ephesians 2 and verses 14 through 16. Jesus is our peace, who has made us both one. That's talking about Jews and Gentiles. Jesus has made us both one, Jew and Gentile. And listen to how he's done it. It says in verse 14 that he has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. How? How did he break that wall down? By abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and he might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. So in this passage, Paul is saying that Jesus killed the hostility and knocked down the barrier, the dividing wall of the Old Testament law. He says by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances. So that should be our one pretty clear passage. No, Christians are no longer bound by the Old Testament law. Just get my attention if anybody has any comments about any of that. Number 2, I'm going to go to Mark chapter 7. Some of these are going to overlap, but I listed a bunch of these as different separate points because I'm going to take some of the things that are mentioned and itemize them, isolate them. In Mark chapter 7 and verses 14 through 23, there's this conversation about what defiles a person. And Jesus says there's nothing outside of a person that defiles you, but it's for what's inside that defiles a person. So he's talking about, no, it's not food from the outside that makes you unclean. It's your rotten, filthy heart that makes you unclean. And at the end of this section in verse 19, there's parentheses in my ESV, and it says, thus he declared all foods clean. So, our question is the Christian bound by the Old Testament law? Here's just one very clear verse that says, no, we don't have to observe the Jewish dietary restrictions listed. I've got on the screen for you, Leviticus 11, Deuteronomy 14, where you find those. Like you're not allowed to eat catfish or pigs, not allowed to have pork. We don't have to observe that. He declared all foods clean. I'm not going to read this one, but circumcision, no, I am going to read it. Go to Acts 15 with me. This one's important for this reason. In Acts chapter 15 and verse 1, it says, some men came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. So that's this question, the thing that we're talking about right now. Does a Christian have to observe the Old Testament law of circumcision? And there were some people from Jerusalem who claimed to be Christians who were saying, yes, you have to be circumcised according to, because you know what? That's not just an Old Testament law. That's all the way from Abraham. God made the covenant of circumcision with Abraham, which is before the Old Testament. So yes, you have to observe the Old Testament law of circumcision. But everybody at Jerusalem meets, the elders, the apostles, Paul and Barnabas, James and Peter are there, and they speak. And the end result is no. No, you don't have to observe the Old Testament law of circumcision. But there's the reason why I asked you to turn over to Acts 15 is look at verse 5 with me on this. When we talk about things like the food laws, and especially when we talk about circumcision, we're not just saying you don't need to be circumcised. When in the New Testament, when somebody says circumcision, it's a description for the entire law of Moses. I think that's what they were doing. Unless you are circumcised, according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Those are the words. But I think the mindset is you have to be circumcised, you have to observe the dietary restrictions, you have to observe the Sabbath, you have to do the whole law of Moses. In 15:5, it says some believers who belonged to the party of Pharisees rose up and said, "It is necessary to circumcise them and to order them to keep the law of Moses." So the New Testament says no, we are not bound by the Old Testament law. I think it's really important as we get ready to go through this class, it's really important to be clear about this from the start. Any comments or anything on your end?
When you get to the next feast and festivals one.
All right, let's go to Colossians 2.
And the suggestion is to include verse 14 as part of that.
Okay. Who is that?
Probably Rob or Linda.
Oh, the Mackies. Colossians chapter 2. Okay, let's do this. Let's start at verse 13. I think that's the Mackey's suggestion. Colossians 2, let's start in verse 13, and I'm going to go down to 17. You who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. He set aside, nailing it to the cross. So all the law and all the legal demands, all that law stuff is nailed to the cross. We don't do that anymore. 14, he disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. And so in this passage, here's what we've got. No, we don't do food laws. No, we don't do circumcision. No, we don't do feast and festivals like Passover and Feast of Weeks and Feast of Booths, and the Sabbath is mentioned in this passage. So all of that stuff. No, Christians are not bound by that. I'll move through this next one without reading a passage, but because those passages that I have listed on the priesthood and the sacrifices, I think probably if we were going to do that right, you should read Hebrews 8, 9, and 10 all together, like the whole chapters. And the thing is, no, we have a different priesthood now. We don't have the Aaronic priesthood or the Levitical priesthood. That's done away with and replaced with Jesus. No, we don't do sacrifices anymore. That's replaced with the sacrifice of Christ. And besides, we don't even have a place to do it. The temple is destroyed, and so it's not even possible anymore. So there's that. There's this giant conversation in Romans and Galatians that says we are not justified by works of the law. I'm not sure that is necessarily one that belongs on this list, but I thought I would throw it in since I have room. We have freedom from the law. Look at Galatians 5:1 real quick on that one. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 1, for freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. In that context, having been set free is we're set free from the law. And what Paul is saying is don't go back to it and try to make people be forced to live according to the law. Don't you submit to that yoke of slavery? No. There's all kinds of stuff in the New Testament about how the new covenant is better And I think Nick made this comment early on that the Old Testament law is fulfilled in Christ. So are Christians bound by the Old Testament law? Without question, 100%, there's no doubt at all that we say, no, we are not bound by the Old Testament law. And so let's just get that out there and be perfectly clear about it from the start of this class. I'll take a breath here. No comments? I've got Becky sitting right here with the computer comments, and I've got the girl sitting on the couch over here. So that's why I keep looking and asking for comments. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I've only got 9 bullet points on the PowerPoint screen there, but I've got 10 on my notes right here. Food laws.
You didn't put a bullet point by representative of Gentiles generally. Is that your 10th one?
About what?
There's no bullet next to representative of Gentiles.
Oh, is that where my 10th one is? Okay, I need to correct that. I'm shocked. My PowerPoint has a mistake. That never happens. After every single class and sermon, Becky says, you had a typo in your PowerPoint. Okay, so let me tell you something real quick about this. You will need to look this up on your own. But this slide right here in front of us is important because there's a word called theonomy. It's theos is God, nomos is law, so God's law, theonomy. And look it up, read the Wikipedia article about theonomy. What theonomy is, this doctrine, theology of theonomy, is that God's law is God's law, and we should absolutely live by God's law today. Not only us individually as Christians, but we should fight to create a Christian nation that operates according to the civil and religious laws that we read about in the Old Testament. And the only reason why I'm mentioning that right now is because, it's kind of, it's maybe more popular than you would think. If you read the news and you hear people talk about Christian nationalism in the news, theonomy would be a part of that. But we recently had a visitor at church that I was getting coffee with who brought this up and said, this is what I think we should be doing, and made a case for it. And so this slide right now is really important to say no. Absolutely, Christians are no longer bound by the Old Testament law. All right, let me move on to one more thing. It looks like I've got about 7 minutes left in this class. I'm going to stop at 9:45 like I normally would. The last thing that I want to cover is categories of the law. There's nothing in the Bible, at least that I know of, there's nothing in the Bible that breaks the law of Moses into these 3 categories. But I think that these 3 categories are good. And I think that we might at least be mindful of them and try to think about them as we go through the different laws and where they fit. Sometimes there's overlap, but if you can think of a different category, write it in the comments or shoot me a text and let me know. But I think everything in the Old Testament law fits in this. Number 1, there's moral laws. And moral laws are things that are true for all people, in all places, in all times. A lot of this would be the 10 Commandments. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, different things like that. Those are universal truths that even though they're in the Old Testament, they're in the Old Testament because they're universal truths and they're true for all people. There's ceremonial ritual laws, which would be things that govern religious Israel, like go to the temple 3 times a year. These are the sacrifices. The Sabbath would be one of these. The purity laws would be these. If you have a baby, then you're unclean for this long, and this is what you do about it. And so ceremonial laws. And the other would be civil laws, and that is laws that govern national Israel. Just like in the United States and also in the city of I'll give you an example of a civil law. We do not have a civil law in Eureka that you're not allowed to park on the street when there's snow and ice. Some of your places, I think Ellisville has that law, but not in Eureka. And so, of course, my neighbors parked on the street last night, and the snowplow was not able to get around them and has a hard time with that. And so it's like, that's just a civil law. This is how we operate as a society. The Old Testament has those for the Jewish people, like cities of refuge. If you kill somebody on accident, it was not premeditated, you accidentally kill somebody, and their family is coming after you to put you to death, there are 6 cities of refuge in the Promised Land that you can run to, and you have to live within the borders of that. If you step foot outside of the cities of refuge, that death avenger can put you to death for killing their relative. But if you're in the city of refuge, you can't be killed. And so, that's just a civil law. There's slavery regulations. How do you treat your slave? What do you do with your slave? When do you turn your slave loose? What are you supposed to give them whenever you release them and set them free? These are civil. There's polygamy laws about marriage. There's levirate marriage laws. So how would levirate marriage work? If a husband dies and he doesn't have any kids, then that wife is supposed to marry the husband's brother. And the first kid that they have is going to carry on that husband's name. And so, it's a civil law. This is how Israel was governed as a nation. And I think that this is the way that most people would treat this with the categories. We absolutely observe moral laws. We identify them and we observe them. Everybody has to observe moral laws. But ceremony laws, off the table. We don't do those. Civil laws, off the table. We don't do those either. But I'll push back on that just a little bit. Look at this. Look at Deuteronomy 25 and verse 4. Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 4, this is probably going to sound familiar to you. It says, "You shall not muzzle an ox when it is treading out grain." So if you have an ox who is pulling a plow or working for you, don't put a muzzle on it. That ox is working. Let it eat. It's just the right thing to do, to let it eat. And I think I would put this in the civil category. This is how the nation of Israel is supposed to operate as a society. Don't muzzle an ox when it's treading out grain. But if you look at 1 Corinthians 9, there are 2 places in the New Testament where New Testament writers take that civil law and they extract a principle from it, and they say a value. Those are the words that Kevin's going to teach us next week. Don't muzzle an ox while he's treading grain is the principle. What is the value behind that principle? You extract the value in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. What's my verse? It's verses 4 through 11. I'll just read verse 9. It says, "For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned?" And what Paul is doing is he's saying preachers have a right to be paid for their work of preaching and everything that goes in to prepare that. And he makes the case that preachers are allowed to be paid based upon this Old Testament civil law. Don't muzzle an ox while he's treading out grain. So, maybe 3 points here. Number 1, you might consider me a dumb ox. Number 2, this is one of the reasons why it's morally, scripturally acceptable for me to be paid for my work as a preacher. But number 3 would be there is a principle in this Old Testament law, even a civil law, that we bring over into our Christianity today. And some other examples of that would be Deuteronomy 17 and verse 6. You're not allowed to put somebody to death without the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. There needs to be eyewitness testimony, and not just one person. There needs to be multiple eyewitness testimony. That principle is brought into the New Testament. Exodus 22 and verse 28. You shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler to your people. That doesn't mean just speaking against the Davidic king. In Acts 23, Paul actually apologized for mouthing off to the high priest based upon this law. And then there's a lot of things, like if an ox gores somebody, or what happens if a man falls into an open pit. Those are civil laws, but they're not things that we should just write off and say they don't matter for us. So, introduction to the class. No, Christians are not bound by the Old Testament law, but we should know what it says, and we should study it, because there's a lot of stuff about our faith and how we're supposed to live our lives in order to be right with God. And Kevin's going to take that ball and roll it down the hill a little bit more next Sunday.